record this. Welcome everybody to the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross community education offering. Today we're having a community conversation with Dan Diaz, who many people know as Brittany Maynard's husband, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. For those of you that might be new to the offerings for the foundation, I wanted to just give you a little bit of information about this foundation and the work we do here in education. And of course, the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation is I'm going to enable transcripts. Thank you for asking about this. We're a not-for-profit organization inspired by the life of psychiatrist, humanitarian, and hospice pioneer, Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. It's in the spirit of embracing all of life, which includes death, that we further her mission and vision through collaborations, education, and advocacy. And there is a global series that's being offered, as well as the community education, which is offered mostly in English. So thank you all for being here this morning. My name is Susan Barber, and I'm going to introduce Dan to you all. Dan has been an advocate for medical aid in dying since his wife, Brittany Maynard, was diagnosed with a glioblastoma at 29, maybe 28 when she was diagnosed. 29 years old. And Dan will talk to you about the story. I had heard, of course, many of us probably first became acquainted with Dan and Brittany by looking at People magazine and the beautiful story they did about the situation they found themselves in. And Dan, I was just asking how he'd like to be introduced. And he said, oh, it's Brittany's husband. That's how everybody knows me. But I actually know Dan as an advocate, as an incredibly loving partner to somebody whose work was so heartfelt and who's turned towards the suffering, not just her own suffering, but the suffering of millions of other people. And the work that she did, that she began and Dan carries out, is really an opportunity for people to have more options at end of life. I think everybody coming to this is interested in education about what medical aid in dying is and what it is not. And I had a personal journey through that after caring for many people with AIDS during the AIDS epidemic, and then some people who had very difficult dying experiences. And as a hospice advocate for over 35 years, there are times where we just are not able to adequately control people's pain. So Dan, I'm going to turn this over to you. I'm going to take myself out of the spotlight here and keep you there. And so please go ahead and introduce yourself. And I do want to say, Dan shared with me earlier that there's somebody that may ring the doorbell at the place that he's at, and he will have to get up probably for 30 seconds and leave. I also just wanted to tell people that we are really interested in questions that you have. And one wonderful way for me to know what those questions are is for you to share them. We'll talk about that after Dan speaks. He'll speak for about 50 to 60 minutes. Then we'll have 30 minutes for question and answer. I'm going to unmute everybody or mute everybody right now so we don't inadvertently get a phone call in the middle of this. But the other thing you could do is put in where you are zooming in from. That's always very impactful. People coming in from all over the country and often other places in the world. And if you have a question that comes up while Dan is speaking, if you just type it in the chat and preface it with question, that would be wonderful. Thank you, Connie, for starting us off. So Dan, why don't you go ahead?
Great, thank you. Thanks to you, Susan, and thanks to everyone who's decided to take this time away from their day to to join us here. I very much appreciate this. As Susan mentioned, if the door, I'm actually at my parents' house. This is the house that I grew up in. So there's somebody that will be coming to the door. If that happens, I'll be gone for maybe 30 seconds and then I'll come right back. So I apologize for that ahead of time. I am going to share some slides. So let me get to tee this up. And I have to say that throughout, as the questions come in, I'll probably pause and we can maybe take some questions during, or I might answer some depending on where they are in the chat. Let me trying to find.
Dan, we can certainly do that. We'll be able, if people have questions, I will just say that if you put a question in the chat, the other way to ask a question here is at the bottom of your screen or the top. There's a little key it's a little icon that says reactions. It's a smiley face. If you click on that, you'll see something that says raise hand. And that allows me to see on my screen who it is in the order that you've raised your hand. And when that happens, then when there's an appropriate place for a pause, then we can do that and ask Dan the question kind of in real time. Thank you.
Okay. So, well, good morning, at least where I am. As was mentioned, my name is Dan Diaz, and I am Brittany Maynard's husband. Brittany died on November 1st of 2014. And today I will share Brittany's story with you about what she endured at end of life, including our journey away from our home here in California, and our move to Portland, Oregon. After I share Brittany's story, I'll highlight other supporters of this cause and my continued advocacy. The promise that I made to Brittany was that I would do what I can to help pass this legislation in more states so that no one else would ever have to leave their home like we did after being told that you have 6 months to live. And I'll share what parts of that legislative advocacy looks like as well. But first, let me start by taking you all back to our beginning. Brittany and I met, it was April 30th of 2007. It was actually a Monday night was our first date. I still remember specific portions of that conversation, hearing Brittany's laughter in particular, hearing that for the first time. We went out on a few more dates, and it didn't take long for us to decide that we were a couple, boyfriend and girlfriend. Well, I guess we were falling in love. Brittany enjoyed traveling, and we would take weekend trips to wine country. Early on, we took a trip to New York, another one to Chicago. We lived in San Diego and San Clemente together. Brittany and I were engaged in 2012, and we got married on September 29th of that year. We bought a house and started settling into our lives together. A few months after our wedding, Brittany started having headaches that would wake her up in the middle of the night. She'd start throwing up and be unable to go back to sleep. The headaches seemed to subside for a few months with the prescription that the specialist had given her for migraines. But unfortunately, by the end of that year, this is 2013, the headaches were back. And on New Year's Eve, while we were in Sonoma in wine country, I had to take Brittany to the emergency room because the pain was just getting too intense that day, and something seemed terribly wrong. After an MRI, that was the first time that we discovered that. They discovered that Brittany had a brain tumor, that it was very large, and that there was no cure. Brittany endured an 8-hour brain surgery simply to debulk. The procedure was to remove the tumor material that they could safely get to in order to create enough space in her skull so that the current symptoms would subside. After that procedure, 3 to 5 years was the prognosis that she was given. That we discovered that just, and then just 2 months later after the surgery, and that's when we had the first follow-up MRI, the tumor showed signs that it had changed grades indicative of a GBM, a glioblastoma multiforme, so the most aggressive type of brain cancer. And at that point, they informed Brittany that 6 months was all the time that she had left. So with that, hold on one second because the the doorbell is ringing.
Thank you, everybody. And I just want to say, for those that are posting the questions up here, I'm tracking those and we will ask them at a break. And if anybody does want to ask a question that's just joined us, please feel free to use the reactions bar down at the bottom. I do see the floating toolbar, that little gray space at the bottom. It usually does just go away once Dan stops, Dan, but it's possible that that's just going to be there, and I'm hoping that's not blocking anybody's view of anything in particular. So thank you for those who have just joined us. Dan is going to be right back, and he will continue to talk with us about the journey he and his wife had and how he landed as an advocate for medical aid in dying and the work that they're doing around that. So thank you all for coming and for your patience as he takes care of some at his parents' house. He asked me at the beginning of this, like, oh my gosh, what should happen? And I said, look, we're living through a pandemic right now. I think answering the doorbell would be okay with this group. So if anybody has any questions or a personal journey, please feel free to put that up in the chat, and welcome back, Dan.
Okay, I'm back. I tend to, well, two things. I talk with my hands and at times I go off on tangents. So I do kind of follow some notes that I prepared. That way I try to keep my points salient and make sure I include all the things that I do want to share with all of you. So with that, let me get to where I was. Okay, so as I mentioned, then after the surgery, 2 months later, they informed Brittany, they updated their prognosis that 6 months, just because of the aggressive nature, they were only able to remove about 35% of this brain tumor. And within about a span of around 60 days, 20% of the space that they had created, all that portion had already was growing back or had grown back. So that's how aggressive this was and the trajectory that it took. The average life expectancy of a person with a GBM, I think, is 14 months. Senator John McCain died of a GBM. For him, it was right at the average, 14 months. In Brittany's case, it was 10 months. There are some people who last a couple of years. There are some that within 6 to 8 weeks, things deteriorate very quickly, and that's all the time that they have. So, so Brittany's 29 years old, and this is what she's facing. So she's determined to live, and we research every treatment option that's available. There's no cure that could save her life, and unfortunately, the standard treatment options of chemotherapy and radiation, those might give her 2 or 3 months on the back end, but she's going to start feeling miserable right away from the harsh side effects of those treatments. I'm not afraid to die, Brittany told me one day. I'm not afraid of death. Death does not have that power over me anymore. I knew Brittany truly meant that. She did not fear death. But I am afraid of suffering, she said, especially since I will die anyways. I would prefer to die gently, not struggling and in pain. Early on, Brittany had brought up the topic of medical aid in dying. In Oregon, their law is actually called death with dignity. That's just the name of their legislation. We talked about it, and I fully understood where she was coming from and the logic of this program. Medical aid in dying has been available in Oregon for over 20 years. The parameters of this program, just to be clear on it, 2 physicians independent of one another have to agree that this person is terminally ill with 6 months or less to live. This person must be mentally competent. They make the request both verbally and in writing. There's a waiting period. There are witnesses involved. Brittany felt incredibly protected going through this entire process. The safeguards are rigorous. And just to be clear, being old does not qualify a person for this program. Being disabled does not qualify a person for this program. Only an individual that meets the criteria that I specified would qualify to pursue this option. So those are the parameters of this program, but what might be the reasons for pursuing it? And this is where I'll challenge you to put yourself in Brittany's shoes for a moment. For Brittany, the fear of being tortured to death if the brain tumor was allowed to run its course, that's the one thing that terrified her. The reality that she would have to endure pain that not even morphine could alleviate. Dilaudid is 4 times stronger than morphine, and Brittany was on some pretty hefty doses of Dilaudid. She had constant pain at the base of her skull. The seizures were coming increasingly frequent and severe. It's common in the case of brain tumors where she might start experiencing personality changes. One minute, the individual seems normal, the next they might be agitated, cruel, or violent. The probability that she would go blind as the tumor grows and puts pressure on different parts of the brain, the likelihood that she would lose the ability to speak, write, and communicate altogether. It's not uncommon for a brain tumor, especially one that size, to cause a stroke. And depending on what part of the brain is damaged due to the lack of oxygen during the stroke, the person could lose motor function, the ability to stand, walk, and swallow. Partial paralysis is likely, complete paralysis a possibility. These symptoms are ones that we heard directly from Brittany's medical team. Do a simple Google search of the symptoms that a brain tumor can bring up, depending on where it's located and the severity. And what I just shared with you, that's a synopsis of what you find. Brittany was already experiencing some of those, as I mentioned, the pain that morphine wouldn't keep up with. So to that, Brittany's response was, I will not die that way. Why should I be forced to? Why should anybody be forced to die like that? I'm going to pause to interject a point here because, and I'll get to this a little bit later as well, but hospice and palliative care are wonderful disciplines of medicine. The individuals that work in those fields, those are the true superheroes. And Brittany's, she had a wonderful care team at end of life. But modern medicine is not able to keep a person from suffering in 100% of the cases. And as I mentioned, I'll touch on that a little bit more later. So Brittany decided to live the life that she had left to the fullest. I took a leave of absence from work. Brittany found a house for us to rent on Craigslist in Portland, Oregon. She got a driver's license, had to establish residency. We found a new medical team. We packed up half of our house in California into a U-Haul truck, and we drive 600 miles north to Portland. That's why Brittany spoke up. Nobody should have to go through that after being told that you have 6 months to live. Once we were in Oregon, Brittany then applied for, qualified for, and was finally granted that prescription for medical aid in dying. That was in May of 2014. But that was not Brittany's focus. Brittany's focus was living the life that she had. Her passion was being outdoors in nature. So we went to Yellowstone National Park, a place that she had wanted to visit for years. A few weeks later, she was hiking glaciers in Alaska with a friend of hers. It was during that trip, while Brittany was in Alaska, that I went to pick up the prescription. And I'll take a minute just to demystify the medication, because that's another thing. Over the years, I've heard all kinds of crazy things. The prescription, in Brittany's case, it was a sleeping medicine. The name is secobarbital. It's been around for over 80 years. I'm careful to explain this because I've heard all kinds of things, and when the media, a journalist who isn't quite informed, they refer to it as a singular black pill, or that it's something that is injected into a person's IV. That would be euthanasia, by the way. If there's a third person administering something to an individual that ends their life, That is euthanasia. That is illegal in all 50 states. The biggest safeguard with medical aid in dying is that the terminally ill individual has to be able to consume that medication on her own. So this is not something that is done to the patient. In our case, it was a whole process. There was 100 capsules, and those had to be opened, and the powder is emptied into a glass, and that's mixed with like 4 or 5 ounces of water. And then Brittany has to be able to consume that medication on her own on the day that she decides, if at all. Her hope was that she wouldn't have to utilize that medication. So when Brittany returned from Alaska, she put that medication in the cupboard, and she truly focused on living. We also, during that time, continued to research any clinical trial that offered any glimmer of hope. But importantly, Brittany was able to do the things that were important to her. We went to Olympic National Park, Hood River in Oregon. We took a helicopter tour of the Grand Canyon. Up until Brittany received that medication, she could not escape the torture that the brain tumor could exact upon her. But all of a sudden, because of simply having that medication, that fear vanished. Brittany had taken that little bit of control back from the disease. That tumor could no longer torture her to death because she held an option that the tumor could not defeat. A quote that I found: "To conquer fear is the beginning of wisdom." And if you think about it, in our own day-to-day lives, we tend to be fearful of things that we just don't understand. But once you start researching or getting some more data, that fear goes away. Similarly, wisdom is antithetical to fear. In fact, it's what enables a person to overcome fear. Brittany was wise beyond measure for deciding to fight the cancer from Oregon. Her determination to fear less is an accomplishment that I fully understood the value of that upon seeing the change in Brittany's outlook from that point on. She was empowered and in control. And when you're facing death, that is huge. I know this is a heavy topic, this topic of death, of our end of life, this conversation of our collective mortality. So I'll lighten it up for a second. This is a photo of Brittany that became iconic in the media. This is Charlie when he first arrived. He weighed about 10 pounds in that photo. And this is what Charlie looked like next to the beagle that we already had, Bella. Bella was maybe 22 pounds. And as I mentioned, Charlie was about 10. Charlie and Bella were absolutely essential in providing both Brittany and me just an outlet. It's amazing what the sense of just love, acceptance that we get from our four-legged companions. Anyways, keep your eye on the beagle for perspective's sake, because Bella, of course, remains the same size, but just 10 months later, that's Charlie. And I continue to rely on that animal for my own emotional strength and well-being. So in July of 2014, Brittany made a video, and it was really a plea to elected officials to pass legislation, specifically in our home state of California, so that no one would ever have to leave our home or their home like we did. And so that was the focus of her video. That video was released on October 6th, 2014, about 3.5 weeks before Brittany died. And as a result, it got all the attention that it did. People Magazine, CBS, ABC, Fox, NBC, CNN. It was all over. Her video was all over the place, as was her story. It's been viewed on YouTube now, I don't know, 12 million times or something like that. She also put 2 follow-up videos. One was specifically as if she was speaking to legislators. So she was advocating for this, recognizing that, I guess that saying, you're 15 minutes. Well, for Brittany, with this attention that the media was putting on her case, she decided that she would do what she could to help the rest of us. That's who she was advocating for. Her advocacy would not benefit her personally. We had already moved to Oregon. So in a sense, we had taken care of making sure that she would have that option to ensure her dying process would be gentle. She spoke up for you and me. She spoke up for anybody who might find themselves in her predicament of fighting a horrible terminal disease that might possibly include significant suffering at end of life. They say that what you do for yourself is gone when you are gone, but what you do for others, that's what lives on as your legacy. And Brittany's legacy is very profound. When she died, there were only 4 states that allowed a terminally ill individual this option. There are now 11 states, and I'll share more of that in a moment. During those last couple of months of Brittany's life, she was determined to live, to celebrate 2 specific occasions. The first was our wedding anniversary, which was September 29th. The second is my birthday, which is at the end of October. So for Brittany to make it through those months of September and October, she was tolerating a lot of discomfort and the worsening symptoms that I previously highlighted. The pain, the nausea, vomiting, the seizures, those were only getting worse. The inability to sleep, it's amazing what a person can kind of accept as, well, I guess this is my new normal. So Brittany died gently on November 1st, 2014. Within 5 minutes of taking the medication, she fell asleep very peacefully. Within 30 minutes, her breathing slowed to the point where she passed away. That was the gentle dying process that this program afforded her. That is not how her dying process would have gone if that brain tumor would have continued to run its course. But, here's the wrinkle in thinking about Brittany Maynard's story. And think about this for a moment. Her story isn't really about death and dying. Brittany's story is actually about life and living. She took control of how things would play out. She was not going to allow cancer to dictate how much suffering she would have to endure. Her story is a story of love. It's a story of determination. It's a story of living life. And in the end, it's a story of triumph. She did not die as a victim to cancer. Brittany died in the same manner that she lived her life, with grace, compassion, and love for herself and for her family. So I'll conclude by sharing a short video of Brittany. This was a clip taken from one of the videos that she had made. And so you can hear her own words on life and love. Let me click here. Let's see if I can get this to. Oh, wait a minute.
I hope to enjoy however many days I have left on this beautiful earth and spend as much of it outside as I can, surrounded by those I love. I hope to pass in peace. The reason to consider life and what's of value is to make sure you're not missing out. Seize the day. What's important to you? What do you care about? What matters? Pursue that. Forget the rest.
Okay, am I back on just the screen share is over now, Susan?
That's right. You're back
Okay.
in the screen, Dan. That's right. Thank
Okay,
you so much.
very good. So at this point, if there are, because as I mentioned, next I'm going to share some of the things that have occurred since Brittany's death, the advocacy that I participate in, what this legislation is. I think that was in the description for this chat, is what this program is, and for me, more importantly, what it is not, because so many times people try to throw a bunch of things onto it and attach it that have nothing to do with medical aid in dying. But before we get to there, are there any questions that maybe I can answer at this point before I shift gears? I'm looking through the slides here. Or there's some, Susan, that you've already.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions. I think that you may touch on some of these, but it might be a good launching point for the next part of this. Well, this is a sort of personal in terms of you and Brittany. Tatiana had asked, was there a backlash? Did you receive backlash for supporting her desire to use medical aid in dying? Was there any pushback for either you and Brittany about those choices? And then somebody, and the other part of that question is, in terms of your life now and potential relationships or people pushing back against that, you're so identified with Brittany and your life together. And so that's one question, and that kind of goes with the sort of more personal
Sure.
share that you offered us.
So no, as far as the any sort of pushback or backlash, and I'll get to that now as I talk to the legislation. Nationwide support for medical aid in dying is 72%. So just by the numbers, there's overwhelming support for this. The opponents, unfortunately, well, they're very vocal. They represent about 20 something, because there's a certain percentage that's still in the undecided category. It's like, well, that depends. So whenever those polling is done, that's the results that always come back. We are now 72% in support. And for those that are in opposition, the majority of that does come from a religious perspective, which I'll touch on in a little bit. But so as far as any sort of backlash, we receive thousands of the actual physical mail was hundreds that showed up. These days everything is electronic, so it was thousands of people reaching out over Facebook, and by and large, all of that was support, people sharing their own stories of a loved one who died tragically, of what a terminally ill individual might be experiencing. For those that were opposed, there was some very creative emails that we received, people stating that if we rubbed special oil on her forehead and put these little signs around the room, that she'd wake up the next day and bam, brain tumor is gone. And we just needed to try that. And then all, the religious and the faith ones. Oh, how dare you? This is for God to decide. And Brittany's take on that is like, yeah, you know, I don't think God requires me to suffer horrifically as I'm dying. I really don't. Now, between Brittany and I was the one raised Catholic. I went to Catholic school. I was an altar boy, the whole 9 yards. Brittany, she did go to a religious elementary school. Actually, no, I guess it was high school as well. She wasn't particularly religious. And so in her mind, it was the idea of, you know, how dare anybody else attempt to impose their religious beliefs onto her. So yeah, that, if anything, may have been the, to answer that question about, was there any sort of backlash for that Brittany experienced or me? And one thing about, you know, supporting her, and I appreciate the way that that question was written, supporting her in her decision, that's all it was. I'm simply supporting Brittany in pursuing the option so that she doesn't suffer. That's it. On the day that things got, they kept getting, you know, worse, where she decides that she actually has to utilize this option. That for me was so simple, because I put myself in her shoes and I'm thinking, if I was the one with the brain tumor, I would have been making the exact same decisions. Sweetie, we're going to have to go to Oregon, because if things get bad, I'm not going to put up with, or you know, tolerate the symptoms of this brain tumor, because both Brittany and I, unfortunately, we have friends whose parent, one died of a GBM, the other was stage 3 brain cancer. So we knew firsthand, because they did suffer paralysis. They were unable to communicate. They were suffering from those seizures. And, you know, they died in bed with tubes coming out of them, a suffering mass. And Brittany's like, hell no, we only get to do this once. We live this crazy thing called life, and we die once. Brittany didn't want that to be a horrific experience. You know, it shouldn't be. Not just for the individual who is in that dying process, but also for the family members and the memories that are left behind. So I will get back, or I'm gonna go shift gears now, and I'm gonna continue sharing. Yes, go ahead, Susan.
We do have a question, Dan, that somebody that asked, and I'm just
Okay.
going to drop her down here too. Karen has a question here. Karen is still is a volunteer at Mission Hospice. Karen, you just ended up turning off your camera. If you want to turn it
Oh, I
on.
did. Because I had to unmute myself. There we go.
There you go.
Oh,
There. Oops. Yeah, they're right next to each other. Click that little camera icon again.
There
There
we
you
go.
are. Thank you.
sure. Dan, thank you so much for sharing your and Brittany's story. Such important message and such important work. So my question is there any sort of medical aid in dying for people with Alzheimer's or Lewy body dementia, things of that nature, you know, early in the disease? Because that is one of my greatest fears, is to be in a situation where I'm incompetent and unable to make my own decisions. But, you know, if the disease is detected early on, is this an option for people?
Yeah, that is one of the most asked questions that I get, and it's from when I give presentations like this, or at, you know, palliative care conferences, or from elected officials, senators and assembly members. So the answer is, unfortunately, no. This does not apply to somebody who is suffering from Alzheimer's, dementia, and let me explain that. And I'm going to answer that question with two different points. In order to qualify that prognosis of terminal disease with 6 months or less to live, and then mental competency. by the time a person who has advanced stages of, Alzheimer's or other diseases that are affecting their cognitive ability, by the time that person is terminally ill, to be deemed terminally ill with 6 months or less to live, in most cases, that individual, those physicians and the family members, like that person is not all there. And those physicians have an ethical duty to, when having these conversations, does this patient really know what it is that they are pursuing, what they are asking for, what they're applying for? So if we rewind, let's say, at the early stages where that person does have mental capacity, then and this is where the bioethics, and I've sat through, actually the sweatshirt that I'm sitting, this was from, I spoke at a conference, this one was from Yale, I spoke at another one at Harvard. And so when I listen to these people with all the PhDs and diplomas hanging from their walls, very interesting. At times, I think they're a little bit too disconnected from the actual patient. But as it applies to Alzheimer's and dementia, which person should they be listening to? And by that, I mean, 3 years prior, this person was very clear. They even videotaped it of them filling out a form saying, if I am ever in a case where I do not recognize my family members, or in a situation where I cannot feed myself, or in a situation, whatever that list is, they're very explicit about it. And they videotape themselves saying, if that is the case for me, then I would prefer to utilize something like, or the option of medical aid in dying should be extended to me so that I could take matters into my own hands. Do they listen to that person? Or do they listen to the current person who is in front of that physician, who, and I've had that family experience as well, where they're not even there. They don't recognize family members, but that person is still smiling. They're still having moments of joy. They're still living their life. Yes, every so often they soil the bed, or every so often they oddly attempt to take a shower. While standing outside of the shower, they pulled the hose, and it's like, wow, they flooded the bathroom. And for all these crazy things that occur. And like I said, these are experiences that I've had, and yet, so there's the dilemma. Who does that physician, do they listen to, the former self or that current individual? So there are reasons, and I offer that just as an example of highlighting the ethics behind that, as to the reason that within this legislation, a person who is not entirely mentally competent is expressly prohibited from pursuing medical aid in dying. Now, that said, and this is where I'll answer, I mentioned I'd provide kind of two parts to this response. This is an issue that we need to address. This is an issue that Alzheimer's and dementia, far too many people with their experiences of their loved ones, we shouldn't have that fear as we're coming to ends of life of thinking, oh no, if these are the diseases that, or the ailments that I start suffering from, holy crap, how are things going to play out for me? And have that anxiety. Compassion and Choices, which is the group that hosted Brittany's video, on their site, they have the Dementia Decoder tool. Visit compassionandchoices.org, click on it, walk through that. It's some really good information. So this is an issue that doesn't need to be addressed. I'll just end with this. But unfortunately, medical aid in dying is not a legislation that is going to include that. And part of that is because if that window of 6 months is broadened, and this is where the opponents to it are so intense with everything they do, and legislators know this, well, then our bills become impassable. We're not able to get them through the legislature if we start opening up these types of parameters. This is very narrowly focused on individuals who meet that criteria. 6 months or less, mentally competent, and that they can navigate this, and they're able to consume that medication so that nobody's doing anything to them. So that's the reality of what this bill covers and what it does not.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Sure.
There's two other questions that were asked as part of the first talk. One, I think, was correctly answered. Somebody asked about residency requires in Oregon. Is it still 6 months? I think you could address that because I think that's just changed, right?
Yeah, so that residency requirement, it's amazing the way that I mean, you can spin anything, but okay. So for those of you who have been to Portland, or maybe some of you live in Portland, Portland is here. You go across the river, you're in Washington. The case was brought in Oregon. And so when they say, well, it removed the residency requirement, anybody reading those stories, or the way that they'll kind of slant it, is that, oh, well, that makes it sound as if somebody from the state of Idaho or Utah, or pick a state, you can just drive to Oregon, get this prescription because residency no longer matters, and then you can just drive yourself back home and utilize the medication there. Doesn't work that way. This case was specifically brought. There was one physician who was the plaintiff, and this is the same hospital that Brittany was at, OHSU, Oregon Health and Science University. Great institution. It's right there in Portland. And so in the case of this physician, he has patients, which if I lived in Washington, if I lived in Vancouver, Washington, I would probably be going to OHSU to receive care just because I'm familiar with it now and it's a great place. So that was the case where he has a patient who happens to live in the state of Washington. By the way, the state of Washington also allows or has medical aid in dying as an option. And so has a patient who lives in Washington but receives care in Portland, Oregon. And so the question is, does that patient who, just because they're on one side of the river, do they actually have to establish residency in Oregon in order to go? So that's really what that case was about, saying that this person does not have to jump through that hoop of what Brittany did, which is to, get a driver's license and change her voter registration to the state of Oregon. But Brittany and I had talked about that. Well, let's just drive to let's drive from California to Oregon. We'll receive the medication, and then we can drive back to our home in California, and she can utilize the medication there. If we had done that, would have been running a big risk. And it just, whoever the local sheriff or district attorney is like, oh, wait, no, there was something nefarious happening here. And then, and that's why Brittany said, we have to move to Oregon. She says, I don't want my husband to be arrested, spend 25 years in jail because of some technicality. Brittany was the one making the decisions, and yet now her husband goes to jail for, having been there at her side. So that's what that residency requirement is. It does not really affect, or does not facilitate a person going into the state of Oregon. And then especially if the person is a resident of a state that does not have this option, they would be taking a huge risk, and chances are that there is going to be an investigation. Sorry, was there a second part to that question?
There was a different, well, people have been posting about VSED up in the chat as an alternative for people with dementia. And we just had a speaker about that a month and a half ago, Phyllis Schachter, who you've probably run into.
Yes.
And she and her husband dealt with this with his dementia. And this is posted on the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross website, the YouTube page. I would suggest people look at it, because I was under the impression that you could say VSED in your advanced directives, have your partner or spouse do that for you. But once you lose the capacity, if you have dementia, your spouse can't legally continue that course. because the person no longer has capacity day to day to make that decision not to eat. So she went through this with lawyers. It's a very informative. I learned so much. So I would just encourage people to take a look at that. You can really see the difference between what VSED does and medical aid in dying, because they're sort of arrive at the same endpoint, but it's very different processes. So
Well put,
the
yes.
story is very compelling. Dan, a couple of other questions, and then we'll go back. There's a question. Do you know of have any new treatments, successful treatments for glioblastoma, been developed in the time since Brittany's death?
You know, on occasion, I'll receive things into my inbox because I still, curious about it.
Yes.
And I have heard some limited success stories. I mean, even back then, there was one going on at Duke University where they actually inject into the treatment is that the patient was receiving like a modified version of, I forget if it was the measles or I forget what the disease was, but they tweaked the DNA and those proteins or whatever would attack the cancer cells and leave the healthy cells untouched. So unfortunately, the size and location of Brittany's tumor, she didn't qualify for that. So they excluded her from it, but we applied to everything. So from time to time, I'll hear that a study had and the positive results that came out of it. And I'm like, that's great. Now, would that help every single individual that has a GBM? We would hope, but no, the reality is, depending on even the chromosome deletions of, Brittany was not a great candidate for things like chemo and radiation just because of, it was some, in her DNA, if a certain chromosome was not present, then they know that she would respond better to those treatments. Well, in her case, unfortunately, she did not have that deletion. So they're saying, yeah, it kind of minimally effective. You can give it a shot. And after doing more research, Brittany says, well, I know I'm going to suffer from those side effects right away, but there's nothing showing that this is going to extend my life. So I might live the exact same amount of time, but the time that the way she's feeling during that time will be, she won't be herself. She'll be vomiting all the time, pretty much needing to stay close to the hospital. And Brittany's, in her mind, she's like, well, that's not living then. So, and those are the, personal decisions and judgments that a person puts in whenever any sort of treatment becomes available. But no, unfortunately, I mean, I'm waiting for the day that we just see the headline, cancer cured, and then we can all jump up, hooray. We've gotten there. But, and when that occurs, it will be a headline. So yeah, the fact that we haven't seen that yet. Any other, Susan?
Yeah, and then I want you to get you so that you can, do the rest of the presentation that you have. A question about somebody's asking, is it required by law where medical aid in dying is allowed that the person taking the medication is witnessed in some way so that there's a guarantee that somebody else isn't taking the medication that's prescribed for that person?
No, so this program is certainly, it's one where only that patient can make the request. So it can't be done. So I'll answer it in this fashion, kind of from both sides. It cannot be done by power of attorney. It cannot be done by proxy. So only the terminally ill individual can apply for, qualify for, and receive that medication. But once that person has that medication, it's up to them if they decide to utilize it or not. A curious stat as far as the numbers, more than a third of the people who qualify for and receive the medication, they end up not taking it. They die of their underlying disease without needing to utilize the medication. Now, the flip side would be, and I've heard that as well, well, what about the concern that once that medication is at home, that's being forced upon that individual? I would say that kind of share the reality. The people who go through this program and all the conversations that they're having with their physician and the other doctor who is verifying that, yes, they indeed qualify for qualify for this program and are granted that prescription. That whole process, they say that sunlight is the best disinfectant. It forces these conversations into the light of day so that that doctor has the opportunity to address any issues. Because I think when people ask that question, they're kind of building on what happens right now behind closed doors. That's really the fear that they're addressing. And let's be clear, this does happen behind closed doors right now. This is how this takes place. This is hydromorphone. This is Dilaudid. This is 4 times stronger than morphine. 50 of these pills is 200 milligrams of Dilaudid. That's the equivalent of 800 milligrams of morphine. I weigh 190 pounds. That's probably enough to put me to sleep for good tonight. But why stop there? There's 240 in here. I can ensure that I will not wake up tomorrow. In order for Brittany to get this, she just has to be in pain. There were not 2 physicians analyzing her case, making sure that she's competent, that she's not suffering through just a bout of depression. So that scrutiny, that whole process, the conversations that they have, it really does flush out what is this individual's goal as far as end of life. It affords those doctors to address issues that maybe a person is going through a bout of depression, making irrational decisions. Okay, well then, you know what? We're not writing the prescription for medical aid in dying. Let's get that person the counseling and the therapy that they need to improve that scenario. And so that's the strength of this, that it provides those safeguards. And I have to say that after working on this for the last 8 years, there is kind of this common, this thread, something about the personality of the individuals who they're the ones who want that little bit of control. They're the ones who are wanting to ensure that, that they're kind of in the driver's seat. These are individuals like Brittany. Nobody's doing anything to her. This is that individual is the one, calling the shots and deciding on the day that, they might need to utilize the medication. So
Yes.
I'll answer it that way because I do not claim, and it would be disingenuous. I do not claim, I have not been in the room of every single death that has occurred with people who utilize medical aid in dying, but I can speak to not just the physicians, but also the patients who pursue this and how that process goes and how, the determination that they have to say, okay, I've got this. Now I keep living my life, but I know that I have this if things get bad. So.
And for the people that are asking about how is the medication disposed, if the person is in hospice after the death is pronounced by the hospice nurse, they ask for the medications. They have a record of what's been given, and they will ask for the medications back, and they will dispose of them properly. And there is nobody that's overseeing what happens if somebody decides not to use that medication. It's not like the medication police are going to come to your house and get it back. So I see a couple of questions. If hospice isn't present, then that person's family would.
Well, and in that regard, it's no different than any medications that we have. I mean, the person had their wisdom teeth pulled. No, I have some OxyContin in the medicine cabinet, or I have some. After there was a time where all these conversations that would come up in legislative as we're moving this legislation forward, where I'm thinking, I can probably make a mixture that something that would be probably rather deadly, just based off of what's left over in people's medicine cabinet. So we all have a responsibility. You have powerful medications, you're not using them, they were prescribed for something. There are locations, for me, it's the local sheriff's office, drop those off. You don't want those floating around. This medication that I just held up, actually, It's the identical one that Brittany got, but this was because I had 2 herniated discs and that was a surgery. That medication's actually in my name, so I'm not toting around Brittany's medication, but it's the same one. It was dilaudid, and it was after the surgery that I had. This was already a while ago, but that's where that prescription came from. So.
Okay, Dan, why don't you go back to the presentation, and then we'll have another set of questions, I'm sure.
Yes, very good. Okay, so yeah, and sorry about that gray bar at the bottom. For some reason, even though I'm not using my mouse, I wasn't able to make that thing disappear. Let's see if it. Okay, this time it looks like maybe it'll work. Yeah, I think this time it'll go away. All right. So, well, so this slide, if you're interested, you can go on Facebook. I keep a page of our legislative achievements. Go on to Facebook, and the name of that page is just my name and her name, Dan Diaz, Brittany Maynard, and that's on Facebook. Search for that. There is a website, thebrittanyfund.org. If you click on that, Brittany's videos are on there. That really needs to be updated, but some of Brittany's stuff from early on, and that's part of the links there will take you to Compassion and Choices. So that's as far as if you're interested in more information, you can go there. Okay, so as I mentioned, when Brittany died, there were 4 states, and those are Oregon, Washington, Vermont, and Montana. And now since Brittany's death, we've passed medical aid in dying here in California, Colorado, Washington, DC, Hawaii, New Jersey, Maine, and New Mexico. So we're up to 11 states. This year, I'm working on still active legislation. We have Massachusetts, New York, and Delaware. I've testified at over 18 state capitals across the country. The number of legislators meetings that I've had, I think I'm somewhere north of 1,100. Senators, assembly members, these are state, well, actually, no, I spoke with our federal legislators when we were moving this through in DC. Despite the horribly partisan charged political environment that we are all experiencing, there still are some good, decent.
These webinars use up so much battery. There's a plug right there.
Yeah. I'll keep going. So there still are some really good legislators that I've met. There are some who they just want to be on television, and so I'd say ignore those, but there still are some really hardworking individuals in politics. So let me share a little bit. Oh, too soon. Okay. So when I speak with legislators, the first thing I do is I share Brittany's story, and kind of like I'm doing here, and I emphasize the importance of the legislation and what sharing a personal story does. So if you're ever interested in some sort of advocacy, I would encourage people to share their story, because that's what makes a difference. That's what we can relate to. I also then spend a lot of time dismantling the false narratives that the opponents try to attach to medical aid in dying. And that begins with the terminology. The opponents, they love, and I mean they love the term suicide. They cannot get enough of that word. Suicide, euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide. You've heard me use the term medical aid in dying. In Oregon, their law was actually called their Death with Dignity Act. I guess both of those would be accurate. I think medical aid in dying is more accurate. The opponents use the term suicide because their campaign seems to be based on fear. That word suicide is a very loaded, is a very charged word, but neither suicide or physician-assisted suicide, neither of those are applicable or appropriate in describing this medical program. A terminally ill individual that applies for this program is not suicidal. Brittany wanted to live. A suicidal person wants to die, or they think they do. So we're talking about two entirely different groups of people. Brittany was not depressed, despondent, or making irrational decisions. Those are the characteristics of a person that is suicidal. So using that term suicide is a pejorative or inflammatory term. And really it's an insult to the hundreds of terminally ill individuals that are fighting for their lives, but also just taking back that control of what happens to them during their final few days on this green earth. So this slide, I think, helps make this point, and I'll walk through it. The difference between medical aid and dying and that term suicide. In the case of medical aid and dying, in order to qualify, it's right there. You have to be terminally ill. So these patients are dying. In the case of someone who is contemplating suicide, they're not necessarily terminally ill. For medical aid and dying, you have to be mentally capable. On the other hand, if somebody is looking to harm themselves, we would say that they are impaired, that they are making impaired decisions. As I mentioned, Brittany wants to live, whereas a suicidal person, they want to die, or that's a whole nother conversation as far as a cry for help and need of attention, that there are things that need to be addressed. In the case of medical aid and dying, the ending is planned. In the case of a suicide, it is often a very impulsive act. For Brittany, as I mentioned, she fell asleep peacefully, and then her breathing subsides to the point where she passed away. In the case of a suicide, the death is often violent, many times with the use of a firearm. For Brittany, or a person who goes through this program, they get to have these conversations about end of life. They're connected to family and friends. When Brittany died, I held her in my arms. In the room right next to the bed there, her parents and 3 of Brittany's friends and my younger brother. Versus in the case of a suicide, that person has to act alone. People who die of suicide, they die alone, because if they are to share, if they involve anybody else, there could be legal risk for anybody who may have known about that. It's not against the law if a person dies by suicide. But if other people are involved, then the charge is that they are assisting in a person's suicide, and that is an offense that they can charge a person with. And then lastly, as far as the grieving process, I'm very proud of the impact that Brittany had and the change that she's brought about. I miss her every day. Versus, and we need to do better as a society. There seems to be this shame that people put on if a person dies by suicide or the remaining family, and we need to do better than that. Suicide, just to talk through this entirely, I think there's over 45,000 deaths by suicide every year. It's the 10th leading cause of death in this country. The biggest portion of that, or the fastest growing segment of that, is our men and women in uniform. I think the number is 22 or 24 servicemen and women every day. It's like 8,000 servicemen and women a year. These are individuals who, because of their experiences fighting wars, that they need the appropriate, PTSD, they need the appropriate support to address those issues. But those people, in many cases, are otherwise fully capable, abled individuals. So I share that. Just in no way am I trying to compare one with the other, but I am, in bringing this up, just addressing why the opponent's use of that term suicide does not apply to medical aid in dying.
Dan, and you may address this, but the other thing that I understand is true is that if somebody is opting for medical aid in dying, then their life insurance, their death is classified as the underlying, in Brittany's case, it would be that she died of a glioblastoma.
That's right.
Right. And
Yes.
so the family would then be able to also, they can elect life insurance. They're entitled to any death benefits, which is not
Yes.
always the case when somebody commits suicide, which, is kind of a weird thing to talk about. But for families, when there's a death, that is very impactful if they are not able to get money for funeral costs or just whatever they need money for.
Yeah, so I've done some research on that as well, because I have a life insurance policy, and I remember reading that. I went back to read up on that. And I think this is kind of the industry standard. If an individual gets an insurance policy, a life insurance policy, and they die by suicide within the first 2 years of that policy being written, then there's a rider in there that would make it so that the company doesn't have to pay out whatever those benefits are. Anything after those 2 years, then, and again, it might be specific depending on the policies, but I spoke with a few insurance agents about this, and they were saying, yeah, that 2 years was kind of a standard clause, that even in those cases, those insurance policies could still pay out. But now specific, again, putting that aside, because that's not what we're talking about. When it comes to medical aid in dying, that is not the case. An insurance provider, even if the policy was written within the last 9 months or 3 months, whatever, the life insurance policy is indeed still paid out, because again, this is classified as medical aid in dying. This is not classified as a suicide. The language written into the Oregon's statute, and I think all the other states have adopted it as well. It says, actions taken in accordance with this statute shall not be considered suicide, mercy killing, assisted suicide. There's a whole list of things where they specifically put those words in there just to say that if you can't categorize his death as any of those things, meaning that it's categorized as medical aid in dying, well, then there is no support for a company to attempt to not pay out on a life insurance policy. But here's the thing, the reality, the number of people who utilize this in Oregon, I think the number in any given year lately, it's between 150 and 180 people. The state of Oregon has over 35,000 deaths every year. This is a fraction of a percent. And this is where I've actually talked with insurance care executives, and they're like 180 people, whether they died, as in Brittany's case, November 1st, because they're terminally ill, pick a date, she would have lived another 10 days, another 14 days. So if she dies November 1st, or if she dies November 10th, either way, they're still paying out that. These figures, these numbers, this is a rounding error to them. So from an insurance, a life insurance policy provider, this isn't something that they've ever, we're, take a position on. They haven't had to, because, again, we're talking very small fraction of people who utilize this. So it's not something that financially speaking, is an impact on these massive companies. The other thing that the opponents bring up is they like to talk about, the most vulnerable in our society. And they make these false claims that elderly and disabled individuals are going to be forced into this program, but it's actually the opposite. This legislation, for the first time, protects the most vulnerable. And the example that I gave earlier, what's happening right now behind closed doors, that goes unchecked. You don't know what was done to an individual who is, whether they're in hospice care or otherwise, and what is occurring, whatever conversations it might be having if that individual's feeling pressured. By contrast, going through this program where it is that individual that is having these conversations with the physicians, with their medical team, that in and of itself provides these protections for that person, so that everybody knows that it's that person's, their wills, their wishes is what's being listened to, and not somebody else. So to that, we do have state-specific polling that shows that people from the disability rights community, they actually are supportive of this, roughly in the same numbers, between 65 and 70% being supportive. So, and I'm going to just share a few. Dustin Hankinson, he had Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, and I think his quote is very telling. He writes, he says, "It's not about people with disabilities. It's about people who have a terminal illness. It's your life, your pain, your treatment, your death. It should be your choice." Kevin Roster, he writes, "I've endured 8 rounds of chemotherapy, 44 radiation treatments, off-label targeted therapies, 3 operations. His last, this was in April, I think it was 2017. The last was to amputate basically his left ass cheek and his left leg to remove a 20-pound tumor. Sarcoma was a disease. It's rather rare." He says, "It has nothing to do with it has nothing to do with having a disability, not being able to walk, and wheelchair dependent. I can deal with that. I still think life is beautiful and I want to live every day as long as I can enjoy it. But there's no reason anyone with a terminal disease should not have the option to avoid intolerable pain and suffering at the very end of life." Stephen Hawking, very famously, before he died, he had spoken in support of individuals, disabled individuals, having this option along with everybody else. We reach out, this group, Disability Rights Oregon, we reach out to them from time to time. This one's from 2016, and I'll share the more updated one. And we asked them, "Have you received the case?" The answer is no. DRO has still not received a complaint of exploitation or coercion of an individual with disabilities in the use of Oregon's Death with Dignity Act. Signed, the executive director of DRO. This one from 2019. And again, I'll just jump to the part to go through this quickly. DRO is mandated under federal law to investigate complaints of abuse or neglect of individuals with disabilities, including inappropriate actions taken to hasten the death of an individual. In the years since the passage of Oregon's Death with Dignity Act, DRO has received very few complaints from disabled Oregonians about the act. When I read that, my heart sank. I was like, oh crap, something's happened. But then I kept reading. All of the complaints we have received have focused on the concern that the act might discriminate against persons with disabilities who would seek to make use of the act, but have disabilities that would prevent self-administration, thereby denying these persons the ability to use the act. DRO has never, to my knowledge, received a complaint that a person with disabilities was coerced or being coerced to make use of the act. This statement to me, I'll pause that for a second, is the most telling, because the opponents, when they show up from the disability rights community, and they spin these false narratives, oh, there's all this abuse that's going to take place and everything, and it's all this anecdotal what if, versus in this case, the very agency that has the responsibility, the oversight to investigate any such case, and that last letter covers about 20 years of it being in effect in Oregon, they have received 0, not 1. So that's the part when I speak at these legislative hearings, it's frustrating to listen to the anecdotal versus it's like, well, we actually have data. That's not coming from me. That's not coming from Compassionate Choices. That's coming from Disability Rights Oregon, the organization that is charged with that very task. So I fully respect an individual who would decide that they would not want to pursue medical aid in dying if they were to find themselves in Brittany's predicament. But to try to take that away from everyone else just because of their own belief system, or because of these, hypothetical what ifs that we have yet to see materialize at all, that's frustrating. That's the part where, well, following Brittany's lead and example, that's why I continue to share the reality of what this program is. These next set, and actually, before I get to this, I'd mentioned that 72% of the population nationwide supports this option. The biggest opponent is the Catholic Church. And as I mentioned, I say that as one of the Catholics who is supportive of this. The polling, as far as support amongst Catholics is 70%. So it's right in line with the general public. The church, their official position is they're opposed. That's fine. They can be opposed. They can have that position. The people who sit in the pews, the congregants, they agree with Brittany. They recognize this is not a religious matter. This is not a political matter. If anything, you would say, well, this is more of a medical issue. And so these decisions, just like any other, should be made with that individual, working with their physicians, with the support of their family, within their own set of spiritual beliefs. After doing this for as long as I have, many of the patients that I've met, they are actually physicians. And so, these are individuals who have seen people at end of life, and they themselves, being supportive of medical aid in dying, recognizing that, yeah, a person shouldn't have to endure. This guy, Dr. Roger Kubler, great individual. Every chance I get an opportunity to speak with Roger, it's the highlight of my day. But he sued the state of Massachusetts. So we're working on legislation, but he was actually going through the court system to get this through. So we're going both through the judiciary and the legislative process. Dr. Omega Silva, her words: I'm an African-American physician who is living with 3 cancer diagnoses. I love life, cherish my family, and want to live as long as possible. I have endured multiple rounds of chemotherapy, and it's extremely important for me to have access to all of my end-of-life care options. I worked on helping the passage of the law in DC alongside Dr. Silva, great individual. And due to her own work, Dr. Silva, she died in 2020, and she did utilize medical aid in dying. So, one of those things, her work on small cell lung cancer is recognized. She was the first female president of the Howard University Medical Alumni Association, and the former president of the American Medical Women's Association, which, by the way, is supportive of medical aid in dying. Dr. Wayne McKinney, a physician here in California, also terminally ill, speaking out in support of this individual. I'm just sharing this because I like his quote. Dr. Ethan Remmel, he had kept a journal as he was navigating his terminal disease. And in one of those, or a journal, a blog, I should say, and he was getting some, responses from trolls or whomever, and to which he replied, if someone wishes to deny me that choice, it sounds to me like they are saying, I am willing to risk that your death will be slow and painful. His response, well, thanks a lot. That's very brave of you. Just shows that, kind of the logic of this is that this is definitely a personal, and it's an individual choice. Dr. Remmel didn't think that anybody else should, have any sort of say over how much suffering he might have to endure. Dr. Swangard, he's here at UCSF Medical Center. That's where Brittany had brain surgery. Also, huge supporter of medical aid in dying. And lastly, Dr. Robert O'Vera, he cared for the most important patient he would ever have, his own daughter, Emily Rose. But unfortunately, Emily Rose did die tragically, despite the resources and connections that Dr. O had. She had leukemia, and they battled it for a long time. But in the end, she says, I don't want to be chemo sick anymore. No one should have to live like this. So just a few examples of the support that we have, broad support that we have from the medical community as well. And I think I just noticed the time. I will stop there in case there's a few last questions, because we're getting close to the end of our time.
Yeah, Dan, one of the things I want to ask, and if you can explain this in 3 minutes, the process here in California has recently been changed. One thing I want to say just before even saying this is I so appreciate what some of those doctors were saying about their ability to make this choice. In the same way that Jerry Brown, who was the governor of California when this was signed into law, said, and he was a devout Catholic, a Jesuit, he was Jesuit educated, he was the church is a huge part still of his life. But in reading the legislation, he realized that as the governor of millions and millions of people, his personal choices were his personal choices. So he may never use the End of Life Option Act, but there are millions of people in California that that are not Catholic, that that they have different faith and different beliefs. And so if they were going to use that, it doesn't in fact impact him in any way, that somebody like Brittany is going to make that choice. And I just so appreciated that he could look beyond, his personal faith tradition and understand that there were millions of other people that may not share that at all, that could be very helpfully impacted by this becoming law. So I just really appreciate that. And yes, it's 18 over.
And Brittany spoke to Governor Brown 3 days before she died.
Wow.
So that conversation that she had with him a full year before we even introduced the bill and it got to his desk, he mentioned Brittany or her case in his signing statement. So
yes. Yeah. I don't know that there's other questions. When a person answered this question, you have to be 18 or over.
Yes, this is only for an adult. Yes, 18 or older. This does not apply to anybody under the age of 18. Yeah,
and Dr. Oliveros, his daughter, was over 18, even though
Emily Rose was 24 years old when she died. Yes. They discovered her when she was 7 or 8 years old. So that's how long she had. And that's a testament to modern medicine. It is fantastic that they had that much time with Emily Rose. But those last, few the last few months in particular were extremely difficult. So that's where she, as an adult, wanted this option. So
I would also encourage people to, if you're living in a state where this is a legal option for you, to really look online. There will be some information that you'll be able to find about what the process is. I don't know, in California, I know there's a requirement that there was a requirement you speak to 2 doctors 15 days apart, and so many people fell through. Within that 15 days, so many people died. And so they've shortened that requirement, I believe, to 48 hours. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, that was the biggest, that 15-day waiting period that was original to the law in Oregon. There was no medical rationale to it. So this is, perfect example of politics, where it's like, well, let's put in this waiting period because maybe that'll garner. This is back in 1994. Maybe that'll help garner some support, So no medical reason for it. And so then you fast forward, and the biggest complaint from both physicians, from both the patients and physicians, is that 15-day waiting period. They're just like, well, what's this for? I'm qualified for this. I have to wait. I'd rather just, like Brittany, have that medication, and then I can focus on what's important to me, not having to wait another 15 days. So to the patients in California or across where this is passed, they refer to that as the 15-day suffering period. They don't call it the 15-day waiting period, because it's like, well, okay, I've qualified. I just have to wait for these 15 days to tick by on the calendar, and then I'll get that medication, and then, you know, I continue doing everything I can to live as long as I can. Now, there are cases where some people wait too long. And so for them, that 15-day period is truly, it's like they don't live those 15 days entirely, or they don't make it to those 15 days, and they die beforehand, and they die in a way that they were trying to avoid. So, you know, the very, and that to the credit of Senator Eggman in the state of California, who sponsored the bill this last time around to remove that waiting period. And now it is 2 days is what's in there, 48 hours.
Thank you so much. Dan, I want to thank you so much. And there is information up. Thank you, Mary, for posting that. We'll include that when we send, this was recorded, and the person who puts it up on the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross website is Ken Ross, and he is currently out of the country in a place where he does not have internet. So he will be back next week, and then we'll have him post it, and we'll send everybody an email about this. And I will include in the email that you will receive through Eventbrite, both of the Facebook and the website that Dan posted, and the medical aid and this MAID website that's just been posted. I'm going to stay on for a minute. I don't know if you can do that or not, Dan. There is some question that somebody just posted about. I live in Texas. If I needed MAID, would I be able to go to Oregon and receive medical aid in dying there currently? And so I do want to end, though I want to respect people's time. We're a couple of minutes over. So I'm going to formally end this by thanking Dan so much for your time and the incredible work that you're doing here. Thank Brittany for her advocacy and her legacy that lives on and on and on. And thank you all on behalf of the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation. I'm going to turn off the recording. And for those that would like to stay, I will be here for a few moments afterwards. I don't know if Dan could stay or not, but
yeah, I can stay on for a couple minutes. Okay,
thank you, Dan. Thank you all, and we'll see you. I want to also say just briefly before I cut out here that on June 23rd, we're going to offer an author series with Anita Hanig, who is her book, The Day I Die, is a sort of history of this movement in the United States by using very poignant patient stories. She is a sociologist. She's done a lot of research about this topic, and you'll all be receiving an email about that. So thank you all. Until we see each other again, take good care, and I'm going to stop the recording now.